Hello and welcome to Parallax, the IPCS podcast. I am Siddharth Anil Nair, researcher at the Southeast Asia Research Program at IPCS. Today's episode is a book discussion, and I'm joined by Dr. Aditi Malhotra, who is currently the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Army Journal. Welcome to Parallax, Aditi.
Thank you so much, Siddharth.
Yeah. So today, obviously, we're here to discuss your book, which is something that I thoroughly enjoyed going through. It took me a little outside of the Indo-Pacific discourse, which was fantastic. And the book, of course, is India and the Indo-Pacific, Understanding India's Security Orientation towards Southeast Asia and East Asia, a pretty heavy title. Before we get into the book itself, I wanted to ask why this topic, why this book, and it came out also in the middle of a very interesting year. So, yeah.
For sure. Yeah, so this topic, like when I started working out on it, not many people were looking at it. This was, say, back in 2013-14. And 2013 is the first time that the Indian Prime Minister actually used the term Indo-Pacific officially. So it was exciting. And even then, there was so much discussion about the fact that India is not a credible security actor in the Indo-Pacific. India needs to, just up its game. So that was one of the things which intrigued me as to why is India not balancing China in the Indo-Pacific? Because that's what the whole discourse was all about. And I didn't think India was balancing China effectively in the region. So it was just this curiosity as to why. So that is what led me to this research in the first place.
Right. So even at IPCS, like we've been looking at the Indo-Pacific for a while now, and things have changed rapidly in the Indo-Pacific. Things are changing rapidly outside the Indo-Pacific. There's a sense of uncertainty, another round of uncertainty and doubt that's sort of coming the Indo-Pacific discourse itself. And so one of the things that we would also like to do, like you've done with your project, is to really understand India in the Indo-Pacific. Right? So now to the book. There is something completely different about the argument that you make compared to the day-to-day discourse on the Indo-Pacific, right? And that's by taking a look at role theory, which is a pretty heavy IR conceptual, something that doesn't come up in that day-to-day discourse. So why don't I ask you, how does role theory better explain India's, position in the Indo-Pacific as opposed to, the realpolitik balance of power theory? And could you give some examples of what this role theory is and what role conception is?
Sure. So you're right, when you say that there's so much discourse which focuses on, neorealism and the concept of balance of power. But what the problem that I faced when I was researching is that the balance of power had specific expectations from a classical balancer. And India wasn't falling into that. So I looked at a lot of different types of balancing, like, indirect balancing, evasive balancing. There are lot of different types of balancing and concepts which have come up in the recent years. But I still thought that it wasn't explaining, the Indian position very well, because there were still so many things which I thought were discrepancies, right? So in that aspect, I started realizing that I needed to look at something which is unconventional as a theory. And one of the theories that I stumbled upon was role theory. Now, what role theory does is, if you look at, again, a lot of general discourse, you would notice that scholars who question the balance of power theory come up with a theory which totally kind of says that the balance of power theory does not exist in the real world, and it does not influence material, material aspects don't influence calculations. But what role theory does is say that, balance of power is very much relevant. It is valid. It's not an antithesis to, the balance of power theory. So what real theory does is looks at the real world complexities wherein countries are driven by material aspects and material calculations. But what it also does is goes against this perception in, the balance of power theory that all great powers, all major powers act in a certain manner. And they are, unitary actors. No matter what country is a great power, it will act the same way. But what we've realized that there are cultural aspects, there are historical experiences of different countries, there are the sense of exceptionalism that a lot of countries, possess. And so it's not just material calculations. There's a lot of other non-material aspects. And a lot of these things are not always purely systemic in nature, because what balance of power theory does is just looks at systemic actions. What role theory does is looks at multiple levels of analysis. So it looks at the system, it looks at what's happening at the national level and also at the subnational level. So it's able to look at a lot of domestic factors, ideational factors, and material factors and balance of power considerations, which I did not think any other theory does so well. And one of the other things was that there's no value judgment when it comes to role theory. Like, let me give you the example of, say, balancer. So if you actually look at role theory, you will realize that the whole idea of balancing and being a balancer is also a role which has been assigned to a particular country. Right? So it's not that role theory is, again, an antithesis to neorealism. It's almost explaining that specific role. So what role theory does is says that every balancer will not act in the same manner, even if it wants to balance. So the value judgments that come up with this title of balancer is very predetermined, expectations, a very Western concept of how a balancer is. So what role theory does is does away with that value judgment and looks at how every country is actually trying to play a certain role. And sometimes that role may not be the standard roles which everyone else expects. So this is one aspect. And the last point about, what role theory does differently is also that in constructivism, if you look at the theory of constructivism, there's hardly any distinction between the rhetoric and the actual actions. And I'm not saying all constructivists do that, but a majority of them do, and a majority of them do not. What role theory does is very categorically specify that, there is a thing called conceptions and rhetoric and, public declarations, but that does not always get translated into actions. And there are these discrepancies and gaps. And that is, again, something that I look in the book.
So actually, you mentioned levels of analysis, conception, and how you are sort of examining that gap between what is said and what is done. Could you then give us a few examples, maybe one or two examples of how India's master and auxiliary role conceptions, or have changed, and maybe as to how, let's say, what is being said and what has been done has flipped around, the last so many years.
Sure, no, that's a good question. So I'll actually give you all examples related to the Indian context as well. But before I talk about what master and auxiliary role conceptions are, I'll just very briefly talk about what role conception is. So every country has a self-conception that the policymakers look at their country's position vis-a-vis other countries in the system. And at the same time, this self-conception is in interplay with the external expectations from that country. So no country is working in isolation. There are a lot of external actors as well. So even if, I as country A have a certain expectation of my role in the system, other countries have similar expectations from me. Now, sometimes that expectation may, align with a country's self-conception, sometimes it may not. And what happens is a country does not have a single role conception. It has multiple role conceptions based on if you're talking about security role conceptions, or if you're talking about, broader role conceptions. What master and auxiliary role conceptions are, that master is the broader role conception. Say from 2002 onwards, India has self-identified as a major power. From 2014-15 onwards, it started referring to itself as a leading power. So the concepts of major power and leading power would be considered as master, role conceptions, which are like broad-based. So everything that India does, one of the broader prisms is that it sees itself as a leading power or as a major power. Now, what are auxiliary role conceptions? These are the smaller supplementary role conceptions which kind of complement the broader role conception. So if you look at India as a provider of net security, right, one of the conceptions that comes in the Indian discourse, and the other one is India as a stakeholder in the safety and security of the Indo-Pacific. So these are aspects, or even as India as a first responder in the Indian Ocean, whenever it refers to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So these are the smaller roles that the country is playing. Now, these are very specific security-driven roles, but they also complement India's broader roles as a leading power or as a major power. So all of these are like in interplay with each other. And that is how these, roles are different.
So actually, we can dig a little deeper then into how these conceptions are further formed. Like you mentioned, there's an interplay that's taking place. It's not so easily siloized. There's a sort of teleology between the auxiliary and then the master role conceptions. So I want to talk a little bit about the determinants of those conceptions, right? In the book you mentioned, and I think this is now sort of the starting point for the Indo-Pacific, which is the civilizational and geographic sort of origins of India's maritime strategy and its sort of trans-regional strategy. So I wanted to understand how the ongoing debate on India having a continental versus maritime sort of outlook and orientation, how does that feed into these role conceptions, and specifically with regard to, obviously, the Indo-Pacific?
Sure. So again, as I've covered in the book, there's not just one determining factor. There are a confluence of different factors, and some of these factors may be purely material in nature, and some of them would be ideational in nature. So when it comes to, some of the permanent determinants, so there are some factors which changed over time, which is why we see India embracing a broader security, role in the Indo-Pacific. But also there are some aspects which are like permanent in the sense, if we look at India's geography, the fact that India has a certain geography wherein its north is largely spanning across the Himalayan range. In the south, it's the Indian Peninsula, which tapers into the Indian Ocean. You have the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And if you go further ahead, you also have the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, bracketing India in a broader region. And then there are these sea lanes of communications, which are the Malacca Straits or the Persian Gulf. So it's the geography which kind of has an impact on, Indian mindset in that sense, and why it sees the role in the Indo-Pacific that it does. And one of the other permanent determinants is the civilizational, and the heritage aspect. So India is almost like a 5,000-year-old civilization, and it has expanded and contracted, under different rules and under different regimes. But at the same time, it had this whole sense of, what I call a national greatness or exceptionalism. It still tends to drive, the policymakers' thinking of Indian role. So there's there's the statement where people say that when Indian representatives or Indian diplomats go outside, they're not just representing a state or a country. For those diplomats or policymakers, they are representing a civilization. So these aspects, of course, influence how India looks at, different things, which is why India talks about having a rightful place within the Comity of Nations. And these are civilizational aspects, which get influenced. And the other near constant ideational factor is the quest for strategic autonomy. And this again goes back to the civilizational aspect as well, because we have literature in Indian ancient literature like Arthashastra or Shukraniti, which talks about strategic autonomy in different ways. And then we also have the colonial era wherein the Indian freedom movement spoke about Swaraj and Swadeshi. So all these aspects were always talking about a sense of Indian exceptionalism and strategic autonomy. And how all this feeds into this broader aspect of continental versus maritime outlooks is that if you look at just the landmass, as I said, the geography. So India is dealing with both aspects, not just the continental when it comes to, China or Pakistan. So it does have those disputed borders, but at the same time, it's also looking at like a huge maritime border as well, and a lot of maritime territory. So all these aspects, of course, are there because of the geography. But again, if we look at the civilizational aspect, there have been times when India has had a very prominent maritime outlook, but mostly it still has been continental in nature. So if we look at the British India Raj period, that is one period wherein even though the British were a maritime, power, when they actually came to India, India became more continental in its outlook as opposed to more maritime. So it was quite a dichotomy there. But at the same time, all these aspects do influence Indian thinking, and which is why in New Delhi, which is again more continental in the outlook because it's more on the northern part of India, right? So there are these aspects which start shaping India's conceptions of what's the priority. And for a long time, India always looked at the continental priorities and the land borders as the main priority vis-a-vis, Pakistan or China. Those were important to be guarded. But it's in recent decades that India is reawakening the whole idea of, the maritime reawakening is there. But again, it's not that, even though there is a lot of maritime awakening in India in the recent years, it's based on how the policymakers or the leadership look at it. So all these, again, these are crucial aspects, but how India deals with these aspects is also related to geography, civilization, and the quest for strategic autonomy and all these aspects.
Right. So you've sort of given us you've taken us beyond the region and back, right? In this, the maritime and the continental, there's no other way to explain it. I just wanted to ask you an additional question, with regard to these continental and maritime strategies. Is that, do you think, at least in your view of the Indian position and the Indian orientation, Indian outlook onto of the Indo-Pacific, if there is actually the space for the continent, right? If you look at how it's from the Asia-Pacific to sort of the majority of Asia itself, like the Asian awakening, and then the Indian Ocean as being part of that larger sort of landmass. Obviously, Prime Minister Abe talked about the broader Asia, but there is also an actual, inland Asia on the other side. Do you think that there is a space for the continental in India's Indo-Pacific strategy?
I do feel, yeah, a lot of people try to, put them across as separate silos, that the maritime and the continental are different aspects. But it's very interesting to notice that there's actually so much integration, even though the integration may not be in terms of, the region or the geography as such, but in terms of the mental, the mind, the mindsets, or the mental maps of a country. They are, of course, influenced by the continental priorities and the maritime one. Now, let me give you the example of the fact that India started focusing more on the maritime aspect was after it also started realizing, and again, China is not the only aspect. So I'm not saying that it's just China that's driving Indian calculations, but one of the factors. So historically, after independence, China was one of the threats to India in the security realm, but it was more a threat on the land border. It was not really, because even China was more continental in its outlook, and it wasn't a maritime power, because of which it did not pose a threat to India. So India did not have like a conventional or a direct maritime threat in that sense. But it's only after China's military rise and its own maritime awakening happened, and China started venturing into the maritime aspects far beyond its immediate maritime borders. That's when India started realizing that those problems or security concerns, which were traditionally more land centric, the same powers are now becoming maritime threats as well, which is why China's ingress into the Indian Ocean region remains a concern for India and the Indian leadership. So I would not say that the continental is not existing. Of course, the Indo-Pacific may come across as a broadly maritime region, but there are a lot of continental problems and a lot of continental disputes, and those continental disputes may not just be centric to India, but even other countries. So there has to be greater balance, but I understand, because the larger discourse is still maritime in nature. So a lot of people tend to perceive that no, it's either or. And I do not think in real world, decision making, it's ever like, oh no, we'll only focus on land and ignore the maritime, or just focus on maritime. So it's not how that happens generally. So I think there has to be a balance, and there will remain a balance, at least in the idea of the policymakers, if not the scholars.
Okay. So we also talked about other countries, and I mentioned broader Asia, of course, and I think that's key to this discussion, which is the security orientation towards Southeast and East Asia, right? We've not really gotten into that. So the book obviously takes a historical perspective. You take us through these various periods and eras where you're highlighting the switching between role conceptions, etc., within India, and how the views from outside, the non-siloed sort of aspect of this foreign policy, there's an influence coming from outside. So could you tell us a little bit about how the India's relationship with Southeast and East Asia, of course, has changed over the last so many decades, and what that has to do with the Indo-Pacific as we understand it today?
Okay, so I'll start with the Southeast Asia region because that's more complex, I feel. A lot of people try to kind of bracket the whole of Southeast Asia as like one single block, or the ASEAN members as one single block. But in reality, like every country is so complex in itself. And clearly there's single consensus at the regional level on any aspect for that matter, more so when it comes to security. So over time, we've seen how India and Southeast Asia's relations have changed. Now, I'll not go into extreme historical context, but I look at how things were in the 1980s. So if you look at India and Southeast Asia during, the fag end of the Cold War, we started noticing that the Southeast Asian countries became wary of India's, naval modernization. So there was this time in late 1980s when the Indian Navy was modernizing. It did not follow through. The trend kind of collapsed soon after. But regardless, Indonesia and other countries in the Southeast Asia, they became extremely wary of India at that point in time. And they thought that India was more of a threat. But what changed was, of course, the Cold War ended and there was so much more focus on the economic aspect. And even for India, sadly, there was the whole 1991 financial crisis, because of which India did not feature as a security actor or even as an economic actor in the Southeast Asia's worldview. So what's economic aspects and building relations with other countries, which were economically, more attractive. But even though India opened up its economy in the 1990s, we do not see a lot happening. So it wasn't a very attractive market for the Southeast Asian countries. But a lot of things started changing in the 2000s. So not only did India's economic prowess, become more attractive to the world, but even its own naval and maritime rise was interesting to see for a lot of countries. Now, Southeast Asia, what it has done more traditionally, as it has become more wary of the China threat and Chinese assertiveness, they have started adopting what is known as the omni-enmeshment strategy. Now, this is not my concept. It actually comes from a scholar, Dr. Evelyn Goh, who speaks about how these countries in Southeast Asia are engaging major powers in a network and integrating them into the broader region. So it's not about balancing China by bringing in one or two powers. It's about integrating all the major powers in the region in a manner that they actually check each other so that there's greater value, right? And there's no single dominant actor. Equilibrium. That's how South Asia looks at it. And India fits into this broader web as one of the actors. So a lot of people tend to project that, hey, India is a very important actor for Southeast Asia because it's balancing China. It's not really balancing China in the traditional sense. It sees India as one of the potential, security and economic players in the region, and they want India integrated into the region. How East Asia looks at India is relatively different, because in East Asia, the kind of countries that we're dealing with, they have greater agency when it comes to shaping the security order in the region, when it comes to Japan or South Korea. And these countries, of course, how they look at India is more bilateral in nature. So how South Korea approaches India is very different from how Japan approaches India. So if you look at India-Japan relations over the last 2 decades, they have improved exponentially. And they're not just bilaterally strong, but even in the arrangement of the Quad or, the Japan, India, and the US trilateral. So again, there are different ways of interacting, wherein you see Southeast Asia interacting with India very differently, wherein there are some countries such as Singapore, Vietnam, and even to an extent Myanmar, which are more supportive of a more active security role for India. But if you look at other countries, say, the ones that are dependent on China, or Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, they are less enthusiastic about India, but they are more enthusiastic for India as a, say, provider of weapons and arms and systems, which would be helpful for their military. So every country has a very distinct, see a very distinct utility of India's role in the region.
So actually, amongst these countries, one of the standouts for me, at least as I went through, where you picked up a particular country, seen the relationship, how it's changed with India within Southeast Asia and East Asia, and obviously you've also taken a look at the West as well, and the role that they play in informing these conceptions. I wanted to just ask a little bit about the significance of Singapore in all of this, right? It doesn't necessarily have the same sort of qualities, if I can say, of the other countries around. It's quite unique in its economic and even military position. So what role does Singapore have to play in the India-Southeast Asia connection?
So even though, which is sad that I could not focus on Singapore as one of the case studies in the thesis, because there were so many case studies I was looking at anyway. But regardless of that, Singapore remains one of the strongest supporters of India in the region. And this is regardless of, the context, the historical context, or, the more contemporary context. One of the countries which has always been supportive of a stronger India economically and security-wise in the region has been Singapore. And if you look at India-Singapore relations in the security terms, they were doing so much more with each other, even when India wasn't interacting with other Southeast Asian countries or East Asian countries. The fact that Singapore was allowed, and this was a very distinct and a special privilege that only Singapore had, wherein India allowed Singapore's military to be trained on the Indian soil. Right. And this is something which generally never happens, because India has always been very wary of external actors in their region. So Singapore has that privilege. And Singapore has pushed India's case, whether it's within ASEAN or whether it's in other formats, whether it's ADMM plus or whether it's any other aspects wherein they thought that they could influence. They've been one of the strongest supporters. And yes, I do sometimes feel that India has not lived up to their expectations on a lot of aspects, especially at the economic front, because even though Singapore wants greater integration in the supply chain aspects as well, I think because of India's domestic considerations, it's not been able to perform according to expectations. But at least one knows that for India, Singapore will always remain one of the strongest, champions.
Right. So, you talk about expectations. You mentioned leading power at the very top of what India thinks of itself in the region, and this desire not just of India's to play a greater role in regional and global affairs, like trans-regional affairs, but also other countries around us who want us to take up that role. So I wonder what sort of alignment strategy is currently in play. If I had to now bring us back into the realpolitik discussion, what sort of multi-alignment, omni-alignment, is there some idea of enmeshment taking place, and what would that then mean for its position in the Indo-Pacific, and more importantly, India's own sort of aspiration to be a major or leading power?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, because the whole topic about multi-alignment, non-alignment, that always is there when it comes to Indian foreign policy. I think one of the biggest myths that I see in the current discourse is that a lot of people tend to see the aspects of the strategy of non-alignment or multi-alignment as an end in itself. So these are more like tools which have been used by India traditionally to maximize its interest in a specific time period and in a specific context. And it's not always an end in itself, which is why we will start, we always notice how these alignments have shifted. So even when India was talking, when the rhetoric of non-alignment was active, even within that rhetoric, India was quite much more driven by realpolitik, wherein it was looking at a lot of things and calculating based on its own interests and maximizing them, in whatever scenario they were dealing with. So let's talk about, say, non-alignment and how that has shifted into multi-alignment. alignment.
Okay.
During the Cold War, we largely saw India sticking to, the rhetoric and, the practice of non-alignment, wherein it said that it did not want, to side with any of the competing actors or the set of countries competing with each other. So it did not want to side with the West or with the Soviet Union, even though it developed partnership with the Soviet Union more so after 1970s. But what India was actually, what was happening with this whole non-alignment thing was that India wasn't a very confident country. It did not want a lot of external actors in its own backyard. It did not want more and more foreign actors getting involved in the Indian Ocean region because it was less confident about addressing those issues and challenges unilaterally, which is one of the reasons that it was jealously guarding its turf and, sticking more to this whole concept of strategic autonomy and, decisional autonomy. So this was more a country which was economically and security-wise relatively focusing only on the subcontinent. So its powers were more continental driven at that point in time. Right. But if you look at what happened after, late 1990s and early 2000s, India shifted its whole idea about not aligning with anyone to now aligning with a lot of partners. So what it was doing was not just choosing one partner, but was choosing a set and a range of different countries so that it could maximize its interests bilaterally with them and, have a stronger position. Now, this was in India, which was economically much better than what it was in the previous decades. And it was also more confident in terms of handling, the security challenges, which came with external powers in its own backyard, if you will, and which is where we see India being more confident, acting as a first responder. We look at the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, one of the biggest, cases, which actually sowed the seed for the Quad arrangement. And then we look at, India as a maritime security actor. So what was happening? Now, India was aligning with all these countries in a manner that they were welcoming these external countries into the Indian Ocean region and what is now the Indo-Pacific, and saying, let's engage with each other and shape, the region favorably for our own interests. So if you look at the Malabar exercise, if you look at India's international fleet review or the Quad, all these arrangements showcase India as a more confident country. But again, what it is doing is these are mere tools and instruments for India to become or, to perform more effectively as a leading power or as a major power. So these are those supplementary tools which makes India, allows India to have a stronger position in the region and have a stronger say and have a stronger agency to influence the regional security dynamics.
So actually, the final question that I have jumps quite neatly well off of the last thing you said. You used the word performance, right? So in the book, there is one of the key sort of discussions that you unpack in your book, I think, is and it's an important one because it's something that, again, in the day-to-day research that we always come up against, which is the conception performance gap, right? There are times when you're working on something like as vast as the Indo-Pacific and you just do a sort of capacity comparison, you feel like, what do you do now in a situation like this? And that situation has become worse, right? Quite clearly in the last year, it's become quite worse, which is why I was asking, about why the book and like why in 2022, right? When there's this whole thing going on. So I wanted to ask you, the final question that I want to ask you is, what situation are we in now? I know it's a difficult question, but what situation are we in now with this conception performance gap and this war in Europe and crisis for food, fertilizer, energy? There's microchip and submarine competition taking place at a very, very fast pace. So what do we have to look forward to for India in the Indo-Pacific?
Wow. Okay. Yes, that's a very power-packed question. So you're right. When it comes to the whole conception performance gap, just for the audiences, I'll just speak a bit about what the whole conception performance gap actually means. And frankly, no country is able to bridge this gap. Every country faces that. So one of the challenges when it comes to any foreign policy is that there are some declared role conceptions or, declared stands or role a country wishes to play in a regional setting or an international setting. But what also happens is, does it actually perform in the same manner? So if India talks about itself as a leading power or a major power, the question would be, is India performing as a leading power or as a major power? Because there will always be that gap between, the declared roles and the roles which any country is performing. And again, to reiterate, it's not just India which is going through this challenge. Any country you pick up today, they have certain conceptions and how they're performing there's always this huge gap. Sometimes the gap is limited. So when it comes to India's conception, let's look at India as a major power. Now, in how India is acting as a major power, there is this very distinct and a nuanced way of how India looks at it. India is a hardcore champion of a multipolar world. It wants to be one of the poles in that multipolar world. So it's not that India looks at itself as the leading power or as the security actor in the Indo-Pacific. It realizes that it can be one of those important poles in the world and not be the only important pole. So in that sense, what India is doing, if we look at, sometimes based on its own areas of convergences and divergences with the West, when there are certain areas of shared interest, India sides with the West. When it comes to other aspects in terms of, changing the UNSC, or it's about changing how the general Bretton Woods system is working, for India to have a greater space and agency, what it does, it sides with other non-Western actors, whether it's Russia or China. Of course, when it comes to the Ukraine war, we've seen India being very muted in its criticism of Russia. And it's not just one reason. We all know there are so many reasons, whether it's Indian dependency on Russia or whether it's this fear of pushing Russia into the Chinese orbit. But what is happening is that India has such nuanced interests that it is very difficult sometimes for India to completely side with, the US and its allies or the opposite side, if you will, because what India has been doing forever is trying to maximize interest by aligning with a lot of these odd bedfellows, which may not always be the easiest. So I think currently what India is doing, I can say it's in a sweet spot, wherein you have all the countries trying to push India towards their side. But one of the concerns is, and I think it always remains, is that, is this sustainable? It's easier to multi-align, and it's easier to, even engage China while you also have a border standoff with them in the short term or the medium term. But the question is, in the long term, during the Cold War, if we look at India, it could successfully stay non-aligned because none of those actors were a direct security threat to India. What's different today is, even if it talks about multi-aligning, China and US, they are in a global competition, but China is also a threat to India. So it's impossible for India to be like, enjoy splendid isolation or non-alignment. That's impossible. So what it's doing is aligning, but in this bargain, sometimes one of the conceptions of India as a leading power if we look at the West, right, they think that there's a huge gap between India as a leading power in rhetoric and in terms of what it's doing on the ground. But again, if you look at the global South, a lot of countries would say that, yes, this is the kind of major power or leading power that we're looking at, which is not just siding with one side. So there are so many dichotomies, and based on who you ask, they will have opinions of how India is doing and how is that conception performance gap. But personally, my question always stays that we have seen India, when it comes to China, we have seen this cooperation versus competition model with China failed before. We have seen that with the 2017 standoff. We've seen that with the 2020, the bloody standoff between China and India along the line of actual control. So these things will continue. Now, it's easier to say in hindsight if India's multi-alignment strategy is successful or not. For now, I think, yes, it's doing it pretty well. It is effective, but the question is for how long? Because eventually it will have to, pick up a side. I'm not saying in terms of alliances, but more in terms a stronger and a much stronger and an overt, alignment with one of the sides. And I think it would largely be the West, because that is India's shared interests are. But that does not mean that India will compromise on the other aspects, wherein it disagrees with the West. So it will always stay this way, and that conception performance gap, I think, will always remain in that sense.
I mean, I think that is something that we'll have to come to terms with. I mean, yes, every country has it, but it's really cool actually to hear someone say that India is currently in a sweet spot. It's very, I would say it's a little different from the discourse. It's always about these are the challenges, these are the sort of and these challenges, the opportunities. But here you are saying that yes, it's not sustainable in the long term, but it is a sweet spot nonetheless, which is I think.
As of now, yes. Like the fact that India has been able to acquire the S-400s from Russia and also saved itself from the CATSA waiver, it has saved itself from those sanctions as well. So I think even though it's easier to just say that, hey, India is doing bad or good, I think there's always shades of gray. In some aspects, India is performing according to its own interests, and in some areas it's seriously compromising as well. But I guess that's how the whole arena of international politics works.
Right. So thank you so much, Dr. Malhotra. We had a great, wonderful opportunity to discuss your book. Again, let me just say, India in the Indo-Pacific, Understanding India's Security Orientation towards Southeast Asia and East Asia. I found it an incredibly fantastic read, and this discussion was even better. I get, firsthand information. And I just want to say to our audience, those of you who are working on the Indo-Pacific, young scholars who are working on the Indo-Pacific who want to take a different view, I would say, of what India's position is and place in the Indo-Pacific, you should definitely take a read. And I'd like to say, of course, congratulations on this, on the publication of this book. It was wonderful. And thank you again for coming on to Parallax.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. It's been a very fascinating discussion, and thank you for those really thoughtful questions. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks.